And we should be live now.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for WAC, the World Affairs Council's virtual speaker series titled, Is the US-China Cold War Heating Up and Why It Matters? My name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are a hub for international exchange, dialogue, and learning located in Louisville, Kentucky. We are a member of two national networks, Global Ties US and the World Affairs Councils of America, through which we facilitate a variety of international professional and youth exchanges, many through the US Department of State. And we offer regular speaker programs and educational opportunities for the Kentucky and Southern Indiana region year-round. Now, our council is a member-supported organization, but we are not member exclusive in our programs, and all the programs are open to the public. During this time, we are especially committed to ensuring that you still have access to expert analysis and discussion on topics that really impact us locally, nationally, and globally. Now today, we are tackling a topic that has been heating up before the COVID-19 pandemic began, but has become much more volatile since then. We have seen a steady stream of developments from the China-India border conflict to Mr. John Bolton's exposés, our continued trade tensions. There is absolutely no shortage of topics to discuss today. The question of, is the US-China Cold War heating up and why it matters, says it all. The picture that is emerging does not look good, but we are very fortunate today to have our guest speaker to break it all down for us and help us make some sense of what all this means, what the path forward may be, and what it should look like. So today we are joined by Mr. Sarwar Kashmeri, fellow at the Foreign Policy Association and author of the book, China's Grand Strategy, Weaving a Silk Road to Global Primacy, published in 2019. Mr. Kashmeri is an international relations specialist, author, and commentator, noted for his expertise on US global strategy and national security. He speaks frequently before business, foreign policy, and military audiences. China's Grand Strategy, Weaving a New Silk Road to Global Primacy, is his third book and was published in 2019 as a centennial book of the Foreign Policy Association. Mr. Kashmeri is also the author of the US Army War College's monograph, NATO and the EU's Common Security and Defense Policy, Intersecting Trajectories, and is a frequent guest speaker at the United States Military Academy, West Point. Mr. Kashmeri has appeared in well-known publications, including the New York Times International, The Guardian, US News and World Report, Xinhua, and Global Times. His TV appearances include CNN, Sky News, Euronews, C-SPAN, and Fox. Formerly the CEO of a New York-based international technology company, Mr. Kashmeri has also served as a communications advisor for several Fortune 100 companies. As you can all tell, Mr. Kashmeri's international expertise is broad and varied. So welcome, Sarwar.
Thank you, Ms. Zhao. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. And before we begin, before I turn it over to Sarwar, I just want to do a quick reminder for everybody about our run a show today and some of the functionalities. This webinar is going to be recorded and we are live streaming it on Facebook. We will be providing a link to the recording after this program is over. We will begin with Sarwar with about 15-minute presentation, after which we will have about 30 minutes of discussion with Q&A. Some of those may have been submitted ahead of time. I just want to remind everyone you can submit questions at any time during this program. We will collect all of them and answer as many as time allows. If you prefer, you can ask a question verbally. Just raise your hand in your controls and we will unmute you. So now I will go ahead and turn it over to Sarwar to set the stage for us with his presentation. Sarwar?
Well, thank you so much. And again, Laura Duncan and Xiaoyan Zhao, I really appreciate this opportunity to come before your learned group. You know, I'm a really, really strong fan of the World Affairs Councils like yours. And yours especially is in a part of a country which which is so important, where so much business is done, and I really am thrilled to be here. The story China-US is a continuing story, and it just it is in the headlines, and I'm just thrilled to be able to present some of my views, again with the idea that we will discuss them after my short introduction of the topic. Talking about introductions, I want to thank you, Xiaoyan, for that gracious introduction. If I had any sense, you know, I would just turn it over to you and disappear, but let me try and work up to how you've described it. So it is my argument that American policy towards China is being formulated assuming a China that has long ceased to exist. And part of what I'd like to do today is give you some background of why I think that way, and then talk about some of the ways that I think we ought to be moving forward, and then open it up to your questions. So with that, let me move to the next slide. But before I do, I call this back to the future, because since the collapse of the Soviet Union, as all of you know, China has pretty much the United States has pretty much existed in a single superpower world until very recently, right? So that's a world that has now gone because China has appeared on the scene and by some measures is already greater in GDP than the US is. And the US now again lives in a multipolar world. But sometimes we, the US, try to believe that we're still in a sole power world, and I think that leads to a lot of issues. So let me start, first of all, by showing you this slide. As you know, the statement is often made that the United States is the most powerful military in the world. That is true. The American defense budget is larger than the 10 largest countries put together. But what is not true is that the United States is still the dominant force in the Pacific. This is an aircraft carrier support group. It's how America projects its power into the Pacific. Comprised of an aircraft carrier, 5 or 6 surface Navy ships, a submarine that is submerged, obviously, at this point. There are about 7,000 people in a carrier group, and it carries more power than most countries' military. During the Taiwan Strait crisis some years ago, President Clinton sailed 2 aircraft carrier groups through the Taiwan Strait. Well, in times of conflict, these carrier groups would now be sunk. China, which has a smaller defense budget, has studied very carefully the American way of conducting war, and it has developed a series of missiles, and rockets, and naval sinking arms and ammunition that now makes it practically impossible for an American carrier group to operate within 1,000 kilometers of the Chinese coastline. If they were to come closer than that, they would be sunk. I would direct your look to this DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, which and the 26 anti-ship ballistic missile. These are missiles that go up into very high altitudes. They break up into different sub-missiles and come at an aircraft carrier group or an American naval group from all directions at sometimes hypersonic speeds, which are 4 to 6 times the speed of sound. And they cost about $200 million each. The carrier group costs upward of 18 billion. So as you can see, you can throw 10 of these missiles at an aircraft carrier group. They break up into many missiles, and that's the end of that carrier group. What most people don't realize, and it's just starting to surface, is that the American military is known for its war games. So they continuously have war games where where one side will mimic the enemy, the other side will mimic the US, and then they'll take various contingencies, South Sea Islands and so on. And in most of these war games that have the Pacific, South China Sea, the United States loses. Now, this is a point that that you should know because it underlies a lot of American policy, right? Let me go on now to talk about China's development. So if you go back to the Soviet Union, the time when the Soviet Union broke up, 79, 80, in that area, China was pretty much at the level of the developing world in Africa, South America. The poverty count in China, as I point out then, was about 90%. So almost 90% of the Chinese people didn't have enough food to eat, clothes to wear, a decent house to live. That was then. And look at what has happened to the poverty count over the years. Right? It is now about 7%, and it is Chinese objective to reduce that to 0 before too long. So this is, and here's, I've penciled in the per capita GDP, which was 300, I'm sorry, the per capita income. That is my curve, which I've superimposed on this. It used to be about $300 40 years ago. Today it is $7,329, right? This is an enormous increase in the development of income in China. Many of you probably know during this period, China has been able to move almost 800 million people. I'll repeat that, 800 million people from abject poverty to tolerable lower middle class. This has never happened before in recorded history. This is a New York Times chart from a few months ago. And what this shows is what has happened during this period to the middle class. So this is a percentile distribution. So we have roughly 80, 85 percentile here, which means 85% of the population is below that, below that point on the curve. And as you can see, the lower curve in white represents what's happened in the United States, and the red curve, what's happened in China. So if you look at what's happened over 40 years, the American middle class income has barely moved. The growth has been almost negligible. And look at what happened in China, right? So again, 800 million people have been moved from abject poverty to lower middle class. The writing on this is a question the New York Times posed to its readers. He said, if you were to take a bet on an 18-year-old who is from a non-well-to-do family with few prospects, who do you think will better themselves as they move into their working lives? The 18-year-old in China or the 18-year-old in the United States? And of course, we all know about the American dream. The Times pointed out that you would lose the bet if you said that. It's the 18-year-old in China today who stands a better chance of furthering their prospects. Now, I show you this only because this is not one of the facts that is widely known. And so when you hear things or the policymakers say, you know, we're going to stop China, we're going to stop them where they are, we're going to stop them from advancing. How can you do that to a country of over 1 billion people that has witnessed this kind of growth over the last 40 years, right? If you look at the market in China, it is the largest automobile market, aviation market, iPhone market, luxury good market. There was a slight tiff between the Italian luxury firm Dolce & Gabbana and and China, and pretty soon Dolce & Gabbana, that half of its sales go into China, was crying out for help. Half of Mercedes-Benz's cars are sold in China. Buick, a great American model, is loved by the Chinese. In fact, Buick makes money on its cars in China. It loses money in Detroit. So a sensible business thing to do would be to shut down the Buick assembly line in Detroit and leave the one in China. But of course, one can't do that for political reasons. I'm going to be going through these fairly rapidly, leave important points with you so that we can generate some questions. And then now I'd just like to talk about what I've spent time in or on over the last 2 years. This is the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which President Xi Jinping announced in 2013. This is China's attempt, China's aim to connect itself over land and sea to over 120 countries in Central Asia, in Europe, in Africa, and to some extent in the Caribbean. Right. So let me just point out a couple of things here. So here's one of the sea routes that goes from China to the Indian Ocean to Kenya, up through the Suez Canal into Athens, Greece. Right? Greece, as you know, a few years ago, was very strapped for cash. And so they leased their big port in Athens, Piraeus, to the Chinese government. The Chinese government leased it and has put in so much investment in it, developed the port to handle container cargo, and it is today one of the fastest growing ports in the world. Right? That's what Piraeus is. The Chinese have mastered the technologies of handling large container ships. And if you don't know about this, the largest container ships today can sail with 20,000 containers. 20,000 containers with a crew of about 8. So what China has done, and it has one of the 3 largest port handling companies in the world, is mastered the art of loading, unloading, transshipping these containers. And Piraeus, which used to be kind of a decaying port, now is able to handle it as well as any of the large European ports like Rotterdam, Antwerp, and so on. Greece is now building a high-speed train connection from here into Eastern Europe. Right. On the other hand, if I go back to China, there are now train connections that travel all the way from China into Europe and into London, into Duisburg, which is right here in Germany, which used to be a dying land port and is today the entry point for German trains into Europe. Right. So the next slide will show you, under the Belt and Road Initiative, all the projects that China is developing around the world. Under this Belt and Road Initiative, which, by the way, is budgeted at $1 trillion. I was listening to a talk by my friend Parag Khanna, who is one of the big Asian strategists, and he told me that he has not run into one corporate executive in America that would not want to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So far, almost every major international bank is part of this because the World Bank estimates that it will take about $3 trillion a year to create all this infrastructure. China has budgeted $1 trillion. So where is the rest of the money going to come from? From a private enterprise, which stands to make a lot of money. So one of the proposals I have been floating is that the US ought to think about connecting itself to the Belt and Road Initiative so that American companies can make money, American infrastructure can be improved, and because this Belt and Road Initiative acts as a conveyor belt to carry technology and investment to countries throughout Asia, Central Asia, Africa, Europe, that it can do the same with viruses for the COVID-19 virus when they're discovered. And that is one of the things that we can talk about as we go forward. And then finally, I would like to point out to you the state of where world trade is at this point. So this chart, which is again developed through Parag Khanna's firm in Singapore, shows the trade between the United States and Asia. It's worth roughly $1.4 trillion, right? And then the trade with Europe and America is 1.1 trillion. Notice that the trade between Europe and Asia, especially China, is greater than both of these. It's about 1.7 trillion at this point. And that's before the European Chinese free trade agreement, that is before the recent advances in inward investment in both countries. So the future of world trade is increasingly between, the volume is between Europe and Asia, right? And I point this out because these ideas of containing China, not doing trade with China, forcing people to disentangle with China, these are simply unrealistic. You can do it to some extent, but you cannot because the world is changing. The world has changed. And so my talk here is to leave some high-powered salient points with you that I hope some of you are not aware of and can think about now as we open this talk for discussion. And so, Xiaoyan, if you don't mind, at this point, I would like to stop. I'm about 20 minutes into our event, and I'd just like to open it up for questions where I think most of the, if I may use the word, excitement and for me trepidation is.
Thank you, Sarwar. That certainly was a very broad stroke of a presentation of all of the major areas of contention and where the issues are. We have some questions that were submitted ahead of time, but maybe at this time, everybody else, if you would take this time to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box, or if you have a comment you'd like to make, a discussion, please feel free to do so. And while you're doing that, I will get started with some of these questions to kind of bring out some more of this nuance of this discussion. So one of the first top questions is really around, let's say, your book. We have a question from one of our former interns who is doing great things in DC right now, but he actually, I believe, read your book, and he has a question regarding that. This is from Chris Reel, who's on with us. Chris asks, you argue in your book that US grand strategy on China should be a visionary multi-layer project to incrementally tie the US and China together. In particular, you argue that the US should join the BRI, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. How is this qualitatively different from the quote unquote responsible stakeholder strategy and the US pursued regarding China? It seems that we have already tried and succeeded to link our economies very closely, and yet China became increasingly belligerent around its territorial waters, engaged in rampant intellectual property theft through major cyber attacks on US firms, and according to the title of your book, is now pursuing global primacy. So the question is, how does more of the same approach help the US compete with China?
My goodness, I thought you were only going to allow easy questions.
Start out with the hard one.
Listen, Chris, that is such an excellent question, and we could spend all the time on it, but let me at least try and summarize my view on this. Let me first of all take this issue that is often talked about, which is stealing intellectual property. You know, since time immemorial, developing countries have always taken ideas from developed countries. Let me point out one of our first billionaires in America, Carnegie. Right? He became a billionaire by perfecting the Bessemer steel process. This process was first invented in the UK. And there is still debate of whether Mr. Carnegie should have paid for the light bulb. When I left India many years ago, India had just invited German jet fighter designer Kurt Tank to come to India and develop a jet fighter. But they made it very clear that if he would only get the contract, Germany would only get the contract if the technology for it was transferred to India. So I am not that moved with this idea that China's stealing that's what countries do when they are developing. I could use the example of Israel, right? When they found out that the Arabs meant to simply obliterate them out of the Middle East, they felt the need to develop tactical nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapon. And they got that technology from the United States when no one was looking. So that's one part of my answer. The other part is, and I will here quote the Wall Street Journal. You mentioned, rightly so, the linking of the Chinese and American economies. It has done an enormous amount of good for both countries, right? Especially, I might say, for the United States. And I remember a Wall Street Journal editorial some months ago that argued that Walmart, which, as you know, gets over 50, 60% of its goods made in China, the Wall Street Journal argued that arguably the Walmart has done more for inflation in the United States than the central bank. Now that's quite a statement, right? So imagine going over Christmas to buy Christmas decorations for $100 each instead of $7, right? Or clothes or so on. So it has done both countries a lot of good. The idea that we ought to de-link with China is simply not possible. I mentioned earlier that China is half the market for so many products in the world. It's a country of 1.4 billion people. We compare it to Russia. We say, well, can we not contain it? Well, you can't contain it. The business that the United States did a year with Russia at the height of the relationship, the US does in a day with China, in one day with China. So this is a huge relationship that just needs to continue. And that would be my answer to you. And I'm happy to communicate by email if that's okay at a later point if you'd like for me to elaborate.
Great. Yeah, there's a number of questions I think related to this, this issue of the U.S. decoupling with China. Quite a bit of commentaries, and many people actually believe that that's possible. There's a number of people in policy circles who believe that is the right track, and there are areas that you can do that. So
yes,
right.
May I just talk for a moment about that, if you
Please.
don't mind? I think, and this is something that particularly bothers and scares me and other people who are not in the establishment camp, right? It is a very scary prospect to tell the American people that we can disassociate with China, we can de-link with China. And much of the trade, much of commerce, much of the wealth in the 21st century is going to be generated by Asia. Right? The average age of people in Asia is around 35. These are the consumers. Much of China's trade at this point is done with other Asian countries. And it just would be crazy to disassociate America from the part of the world which is going to be the generator of wealth in the 21st century. We ought not to be talking about that. Now, I do agree that China does have some ways to go to live up to its promises of opening up the economy, to not be subsidizing its countries or being transparent about them. But I would point to the European Union, which is in the process of treating China as a competitor, but they have not stopped growing their commerce. They've not stopped growing their trade. They're doing what I think we ought to be doing, which is taking really critically important industries, vaccines, medicine, masks, and making sure that we never again have to rely on other countries for that. But even that is a two-edged sword. I was listening to a speech by the CEO of New York Presbyterian Hospital, which is one of the largest medical centers in the world, and they employ 45,000 people. And at the height of the pandemic in New York, they use about 4,000 masks a day. They were using 100,000 masks a day at the height of the pandemic. And he pointed out that the largest supply chain they had was out of China. And interestingly, Italy was number 2. So we need to be very careful when we talk about decoupling. This is an interconnected world, and we simply cannot walk away. The US did that for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that's come back to hurt us because instead of American leadership, we now have Chinese leadership. And finally, I leave this on the table for whatever it's worth, that my knowledge of Asian business people and of Asian people in general is that they work with their wallets. All this business of national pride and flag waving is important for politicians and countries. Quick personal story I can tell you is when I was in Singapore some months ago, I was invited to a speech in Beijing and I didn't have a visa. So I went to the Chinese embassy and a few days later they called me and said, we have your visa. So I rolled in there and they said that'll be 290 US dollars. So I was born in India, I was back in Asia, and I listen, I'm just a poor professor and can we do something about the price? And this diplomat held up my American passport and he said, Kashmiri, it's not about who you are, but where you're from. A real message. But then he smiled and he said, but can we make a deal? He said, what if I give you a 10-year multiple entry visa for the same price as your visa? And I said, I shook his hand. I said, that's a deal. So he changed his rubber stamps. And so I must be one of the few people that now have a 10-year multiple. I mentioned that only to say that what drives China, in my opinion, what drives people in Asia is business. And I don't think we can forget that.
That's a really great story. I guess some of the questions, a lot of things that you've said are certainly the things that we've been thinking of, and the U.S. policy even before this, before the COVID-19. Has any of that really changed now, especially given the fact that the pandemic has, in many ways, shined a kind of the dominance that China has over the supply chains of the world, basically, and especially around the healthcare. And many other countries, you're right, in terms of China may not be doing anything necessarily different. That's great. But for countries like the US, how does that's going to be, factoring into their strategy? Has this pandemic broken some of that Chinese dominance over the supply chains? Maybe not immediately. Do you see that going forward more?
I think that's a great question. And I think that story is still unfolding, right? I mean, I think we haven't seen the end of it. Part of it has to do with this group that says we need to blame China for starting this contagion, that in some way China will have to pay for it. I don't find myself party to that debate because I don't think blaming someone gets one anywhere. I think the Chinese have earned a lesson on this one. And I do believe that there will continue to be a certain amount of decoupling. I would hope anyway that in both Europe and the United States, especially in the United States, whose policy I spent time thinking about, that we will use this to change, as I mentioned earlier, the very vital components that we make. I mean, there are at least 3 weapon systems in the US Navy, at least 2 in the US military, whose construction depends on parts that come in from China, right? So maybe this is something that cannot be avoided. But as a person who also thinks about national security strategy, I would try like heck to make sure that going forward that not only China, but these critical components are not manufactured in the supply chain for issues like weapon systems, for medicine, for masks. Now, given that there is a certain amount of that you just can't be spending money preparing for the worst possible case. I might here give you the example of Switzerland. That has made sure it won't run out of flour and medicines and so on. And it's a small country, but what it did was it pulled all of the industry together. And it said, listen, one of the things we can't do without is disinfectants. So here, you 5 companies that make disinfectants, you're going to be the one to make enough to put in a stockpile. You keep it in your warehouses. We don't have the money to do that. And it's not efficient. And in case of emergency, you will use your logistics and supply chain to push what you're responsible for around the country, right? So it seems to me that these are the kinds of best practices that the US needs to be looking at. Now, besides that, I just think that that delinking from China is not feasible and ought not to be feasible. Or ought not to be done, because you look at something like the iPhone, right? There are about 30 countries that manufacture parts that go into the iPhone, which are all made in these countries, shipped to China, where the iPhone is assembled. That is just one example, and we can go on from there. And why unnecessarily bring things back here? I mean, my camera and my computer gave out, so I had to run out and buy this webcam, which cuts off top of my head. So I'll ask some money back from them at some point. But I mean, this thing cost $25, right? If I had to go in and pay $100 for that as a sole practitioner, I mean, I used to have a company, I don't anymore, it would be a hardship for me. Do we really need to go back to that? It's just a small example of this. So I believe there will be delinking. I believe we need to prioritize that, but I don't believe that will happen to any large extent.
Great. Well, in the meantime, we've got quite a number of questions, very good questions. I'm just going to start from one of the top ones from Dave Wigman, who's one of our board members. Thanks, Dave. He asks, how should the U.S. best position itself with China to best deal with North Korea? And that's pretty much the question. The question is, how do we manage North Korea with China?
Yeah, I thought it was already over. I thought they'd been managed. You know, that's $1 million question, right? And I'd like to start that by saying, I mean, there are lots of reasons why people are critical of the way Mr. Trump handled the policy, right? But I hasten to point out that this, if I can use the word containment of North Korea, did not start with Mr. Trump, right? It probably started with President Carter, reasonably close to that. If you think about North Korea then, Dave, and I'd love to have you follow up if you are so willing after this. I mean, if you go back to that time, North Korea did not have an atomic weapon. North Korea did not have guided missiles. North Korea didn't have the ability to guide those missiles into Washington, D.C. Right? So we've gone through all of these presidents, right? The two Bushes and Mr. Obama and so on. And what is the state now? We have North Korea that not only has an atomic weapon, nuclear weapon, but has the means and the guidance systems to drop them on the US. So what have all of these countries really, all of these presidents really achieved for us? Might be a realistic question to ask. My own feeling is that that North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons unless it feels safe enough to where it is not going to be overthrown, which it seems to me is behind the strategy that the United States and perhaps especially the United States wants to pursue. So I think we will have to realistically come to an understanding that we cannot stop their growth of nuclear weapons and guidance systems. And how do we then engage them? I mean, it's one thing that one point that they've made, the North Koreans, is that they're not suicidal. So there has to be something that can work. And I think we can only do that by engaging them, engaging China, and including South Korea in the process. I don't have the answer to that, I think, but that's the road I think we need to go to. If I had the answer to it, I would have made as much money selling my book as Henry Kissinger does selling his book in China. So Dave, I hope that that gives you what I feel. If you have a follow-up, I'd be happy to tackle that.
Great. Well, Dave, do you have a follow-up? So I will go ahead and unmute him. Okay, Dave, you are on. Oh, wait, we need to unmute him. Let's see. I think we can unmute.
Can Dave unmute from his side?
For some reason, yes. Dave, can you unmute from your side? Yeah. While we're waiting, maybe when we can, oh,
Yeah.
there he is.
I hear you.
Thank you. I would only extend my question to ask if there are specific economic approaches to doing what you discussed in a more general matter in terms of the economic relationships between the United States and China and North Korea, ways of putting reasonable pressure that would be acceptable to China and also might move us forward.
Right. I think that's an excellent question, and I think that that is certainly an avenue that we must pursue, because after all, North Korea and China are partners in what's taking place. We've not, unfortunately, tried that, but I think we ought to. Maybe a new administration, whether it is a new Trump or a new Biden administration, can take that approach. I mean, ultimately, I think what, in my opinion, and I hope, David, that you agree, that what North Korea wants to do is to feel safe that its government will not be overthrown. But if it keeps hearing that, you know, this is a renegade government, this is a government that is so far out that we can't stand it running any country in the world, all of that may be true, but I think we need to be working to make these changes happen. Money always talks, and I think engaging China and North Korea without any preconditions is the way to go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Well, sticking with that, the question about geopolitics and really the nuclear issue, we have a question from Matthew who asks, how likely is China to resort to attacking and or sinking a US aircraft carrier group, given the likely very serious repercussions, especially given the fact that both US and China are nuclear powers? What security threshold would trigger this action, and how is the US likely to respond to such an attack?
Well, Shinzu, the famous Chinese war strategist, always said that the best way to win a war is to convince the other side that there ought to be no war. Mm-hmm. And I myself do not believe that either China or America will get into a nuclear war, because if it does, it's the end of the world anyway, right? I mean, China has 200 or 300 nuclear missiles. I don't know quite the exact number. And America, I don't know the exact number, has as many thousands. But I mean, after you hit each other with 10 or 20 nuclear hydrogen bombs, you know, what's left of the world anyway? Who wants to live in it? So I mentioned that statistic along the lines of what Shinzu advocated, which is China has taken, it has a defense budget, the best we know, of around 400 billion. The United States budget, the best we know, is around 700 to 800 billion. So it's taken most of that money and secured its coastline. I'm in the camp of the American strategists who don't believe that China really wants to be the military hegemon of the world. I think they just want to make sure that nobody ever invades them again. They've gone through 100 years of what they call, you know, the period of humiliation, and they've done that. So now people are starting to realize that that's where Chinese anti-access, anti-approach missile system is. And hopefully American strategy will now be constructed assuming that. So I don't believe China is going to use their capability to sink an American carrier group. It would be suicide. I mean, they'd cease to exist in about 20 minutes, or let's say an hour and 20 minutes. So I don't believe that's going to happen. So that question is very important, because remember that when America relied on its ICBMs for defense, we had ICBMs scattered all over the country, on planes, on naval ships. It wasn't because we really wanted to pick a nuclear war, but we'd advertised that, listen, we can respond to anyone attacking us in minutes. And there was not. I mean, the Soviet Union, the containment policy worked because of that, and so on. So that would be my answer.
Great, thank you. We have one question from Dr. Jean Absher, who asks, one aspect of China's engagement is volume, lots of points of contact in the Belt and Road. But quality of those relations is another point. Some countries are finding China's financial infusions less than altruistic, and indeed coming with some serious costs with some African countries, such as Sri Lanka. So does the quality of China's foreign policy present a limitation to its reach?
Another excellent question. And it's not just excellent because of the way in which it was asked, but it's excellent because of its importance to formulating American strategy. So let me first of all make a flat out statement that there are about 1,000 projects now underwritten by China on the Belt and Road Initiative. There is not evidence of one, and I will repeat that. There is not evidence of one project which has been taken over by China because of non-payment, where China has suckered in a country because it wanted to take over real assets. And I would leave Dr. Dushan with the resource, and maybe the rest of you can at some point find time to look at it. Dr. Deborah Brodigan of Johns Hopkins University runs the Africa, I think it's called the Africa Asia Research Center. It is the go-to place to look at loans that China makes, to look at projects that are being developed on the Belt and Road Initiative. And she is horrified at how quickly this information has entered the general conversation. This debt trap diplomacy. It's interesting. Let me take a minute on this. The phrase debt trap diplomacy was invented by an Indian think tank around New Delhi, right, some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. It was such a catchy phrase. And at that time, they were talking about the Sri Lanka port that was taken over by China because Sri Lanka couldn't make the payments. The truth there was that Sri Lanka was in hock to the World Bank, to China and others before this port money was put in, right? And the Prime Minister then of Sri Lanka, his province stood to benefit from all this millions of dollars that were coming in. So it was a very politically driven decision. And in fact, when Sri Lanka turned over the port to China, China paid $700–800 million, which Sri Lanka then immediately used to pay off all, much of the debt that it had, or much of the due debt that it had already gathered. And that port now is getting marketing dollars and is starting to become, much more efficient. And by the way, there are 3 other projects that the Sri Lanka governments have started with China since the time of that takeover. And so this phrase of debt diplomacy was started by an Indian think tanker outside New Delhi. It was picked up by the New York Times. It was picked up by some other papers. And it's such a catchy phrase that it just spread. And I would urge those of you who are interested in this topic to go and look at the work that Dr. Brodigan's Center has done at Johns Hopkins to get some real numbers on what the truth is, what the facts are, and then come to your own conclusion.
Right, thank you. We have a couple more questions, and we also are a little bit close to our time, so I'm going to try to lump some of these questions together and then have some final thoughts. These next couple of questions, I think, really deal with the corporate American companies. The question that one asks is, you suggested that the U.S. should participate in the Belt and Road Initiative in order to benefit from infrastructure improvements. What would that mean for the U.S. and what are the potential security implications? And then a follow-up on that is just in general, what are your thoughts about, how corporate America is responding to American policies that might potentially restrict their access either to the Chinese market or the other opportunities internationally, and along with the idea that companies tend to, how they strategize in the short term versus long term, and how that aligns with how our policy go cyclical.
Right. Again, excellent questions, and some of the headline topics today. So first of all, what I'm proposing is that the United States think of a project that will involve Chinese expertise, American money, American technology, Chinese technology. And by the way, this is not widely known, but a large part of Boston's commuter railroad cars are being built by one of the biggest companies that works on BRI projects, right? Boston did a proposal, and this Chinese company won. I've talked to the cabinet official of the governor who made this decision to get the Chinese company. And he told me that it was a months-long process. And all the big companies in the world, Kawasaki, Hyundai, Bombardier, came in with proposals, but they picked the Chinese company because it was the lowest, but also because they had the only record of producing things on time. So these 200 railroad cars are now coming out of this factory in Springfield, Massachusetts that was built with Chinese dollars. It employs 200 Americans at this point. Massachusetts is about to become an exporter of these cars to Atlanta and Los Angeles, right? So here's an idea that is already working in the United States. We have hundreds of American and Chinese scientists who are working together to develop COVID-19 viruses. We have a Shanghai real estate tycoon who's just funded a project at Harvard University to work on joint projects. So, I mean, there are all of these things. And by the way, Congress really came down hard from Boston, and they said, have you thought about how the Chinese will spy in these commuter railroad cars? I mean, it's hilarious to think that China wants to spend its time looking at what Boston commuters are carrying to their work in the city. So we shouldn't overdo this. There are security implications in chip technology and so on, but I just think we need to take ideas that are not in full circulation. I think we are unnecessarily over scared of China. And I think we really risk, and we are almost there, of treating China as an enemy. I mean, I don't think the Biden administration is going to be that different from Mr. Trump's. I think the establishment has just made up its mind that we want nothing to do with China. Well, guess what? The rest of the world will do with China, and we'll be left behind like the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? So let me, I know you want to talk, get some final thoughts in, right? But those are some of my ideas. And I say that as a person who would not want to live in any other country with the United States. I decided that 4 decades ago. But we need to base our China policy on realistic assumptions. And I don't believe we are doing that. I'm not the only one, but I'm starting to talk about this. And I'd like to end on that. And again, thank you, and thank the group that asked these questions. I mean, I can't think of more important resource that America has than the World Affairs Council, because you bring people who read, they're engaged, they ask questions with scarce speakers. You know, what better way to handle this? Let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sarwar. That's a very enlightening conversation. And I know we have quite a number of other questions that we didn't get to, you know, around just the idea of how America can kind of maintain or perhaps pick up on its moral authority in the world, try over the Chinese as a competitor, and questions around those. So I know we have many things that we didn't get to, and I apologize for everyone that's on here, but I am sure the good thing is as soon as we are able to have in-person talks, we will fly Sarwar over to Louisville, where I'm sure he's going to enjoy meeting everyone to do a live program, and we will have a lot less time limitations on those. So with that, I just want to thank Sarwar for your analysis and your expert insights with us today. And I highly recommend your book. And we will be sending a link after the program with the book and information. It's a brief book. It's, as far as these books go, it's very short, but it's very well documented. I hope that people will be able to pick it up. And with that, I want to thank everybody else who's joining us today, who have joined us and submitted your questions. And I hope that we will see you very soon for another program. And if we can't get all of your questions answered, we will try to do so at another time. Thank you very much. And
Thank
with
you
that,
very much.
goodbye.
See you in Louisville.
See you in Louisville. Bye-bye.
Bye.